That would be thanks.
All right, so I think we're just about good to start. So first off, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy beginning to the school year / squash season for this Tuesday night town hall, mostly about the junior squash system. One of the reasons that, well, I guess first I'll introduce myself. I'm Harry Smith. I work with US Squash. I'm the Director of Junior Development. I've been with the organization for about 7 years now, and I'm accompanied by Kim Clearkin. She's the Vice President of Programs and Events, so she basically covers all things competitive within the sport of squash in the States. I'm primarily focused on the junior programming. But so obviously we announced a ton of changes at the end of last year, late May, early June, just in time for all of you to go off on your summer breaks. But as we were talking over the summer and fielding phone calls, answering emails, and having one-on-one interactions with families, we realized that come September, this was important to kind of get out in front of the community, talk through these changes, contextualize them, talk through our philosophy and our processes for making changes like this, and effectively talk through why we think these changes will be beneficial to the system overall. Make sure that there's an understanding that there is a philosophy behind the changes we make, that we do think deeply about any changes we make before we implement them, and then also just engage in conversation, as we know that there are certain questions and concerns that many of you have about how these changes are impacting your schedules, and more importantly, your children's squash careers as they progress in the system. So
that's good. I think we'd like to just go through the presentation first and kind of explain our story, and then if you could just hold your questions until the end, so you'll get the full picture, and I think then you'll see how everything fits together. There are a lot of pieces to this. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. So let's put them all together, and then ask questions about specific policies that might be concerning you. Does that sound okay with you guys?
Right. Yeah, I guess just lastly, from a timing standpoint, we will probably stand in front of this screen with a presentation talking for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, and then we'll open up to a question and answer for, I guess, 30, 45 minutes, as long as you guys kind of continue to have some questions for us. We will need to cut it off at some point, but yeah, we're here to answer questions and kind of help you all understand the system to the best of our abilities. So again, just a quick overview of what we're going to talk through tonight. We're going to start with the vision for junior squash in the States, and then we're going to move into effectively walk you through some of the data that we pulled last year, talk through our process, and explain effectively what the state of junior squash was according to the data that we pulled at the end of last year. Then we'll go through mostly the structural enhancements that were announced, namely the reduced draw sizes at the gold and silver and bronze level. As we said, there were 16 changes that were announced at the end of the year. There are fairly extensive documents at the top of the guidelines on the website that detail out point by point specifically what the changes were, accompanied by rationale. And then there's a separate document for just some of the data that was supporting the change, or at least in our mind, supporting it and rationalizing it. So we felt that it would just be a more productive use of everyone's time if we were to just talk through the philosophy behind it, make sure everyone was on the same page and understood where we were coming from. And then we'll talk through effectively where we're going to go from here, what data we're going to continue to monitor. And I do think that's important to note that when we do make these changes, it's not book closed, story over. We continue to monitor. We have intended outcomes or expected outcomes accompanied with these changes that we make, and we measure the effectiveness of them, and we're ready and willing to make additional adjustments or further changes if those outcomes are not being met. So effectively, vision for the junior squash. The difficult piece with the United States is it's such a huge geography. When squash started here in the States, and for all those of you who don't know, US Squash was, I believe, first formed in 1904. So it's been here for a very long time as a sport. It had its roots mostly on the East Coast, and it's been slowly creeping to all corners of the country, which is pretty exciting. But on the flip side of that, trying to tie together a competitive structure that translates into an accurate ranking system is fairly difficult when you have such a large pocket on the East Coast, mostly between DC and Boston. But then we have pockets growing out in Cleveland and Cincinnati, down in the Southeast, Texas, Houston. Growth has been huge. San Francisco, and branching down to Los Angeles, San Diego, and up to Seattle. So it is starting to grow, and it's becoming an increasingly national sport rather than just an East Coast centric one. And as a result, U.S. squash, we need to take a step back and evaluate that growth and basically grow with it and adjust with that growth to make sure that the system is suitable to as many people as possible, it's inclusive to as many people as possible, and it's providing the opportunity for competitive play for all the juniors that want to. So ultimately, we want engagement at all levels. We want people to mostly be able to play locally. Right now, one of the senses that we've been getting and what we've been hearing a lot about is the sport requires a lot of travel. And part of that has to do with, which we'll get into a little bit later, but it's been predominantly a two-tier system, even though we have 4 tiers, the bronze, silver, gold, JCT, and then I guess 5 tiers if you include the Team USA programming. But most players do gravitate to gold tournaments because there's higher point values and there's more competition there. And the silver and bronze tournaments are smaller and weaker, and needs aren't necessarily met locally at those tournaments. So therefore, I'm new to the sport. I jump to a gold tournament, and then all of a sudden I find myself in that situation where there's only 18 gold tournaments, let's say nationally, across the entire season, and you need to start flying around the country in order to participate, which is very difficult and doesn't provide as much opportunity and access as we hope for. So ultimately, we believe that by reinforcing this pyramid structure, it reinforces that entry level. So hopefully we want to increase the size and the competition at silver and bronze levels tournaments. So as I was saying, gold tournaments, there's roughly 18 tournaments nationally. I think this year it's probably 20 or 21. But once we go down to silver and bronze tournaments, that accounts for an additional 140 plus tournaments. So that immediately would mean if those tournaments are more competitive and more full, maybe I'm finding my needs for squash in a competitive structure locally, and I don't necessarily need to jump up to that gold level. Or I can play locally until I'm ready, and I make that decision myself to jump to that gold level and take on that higher level of commitment, which brings in more travel and everything that comes along with it. So again, we want to reinforce that pyramid structure. We want to localize the competition, which hopefully will increase access for more people, provide more meaningful local competition for more people, which will reduce travel costs. It'll reduce the travel needs. It'll reduce expenses. Will reduce missed school days, and hopefully have a more positive engagement for all players. I think that covered it. So then moving on, I mentioned the process, and we do think, as I said, we do think deeply about all of these changes or any changes that come across our desk or that we think up one day. It's never just a random shot as to, let's try and change the system next year because we think it'll be fun. We do collect feedback, as I'm sure all of you recognize Kim, at least for her presence, and Sakura for their presence at tournaments. I've been at fewer tournaments than Kim and Sakura for the past couple of years, but I know most of you have emailed with me or talked to me on the phone about various concerns or providing feedback or just asking policy questions. So we take feedback in the form of tens of thousands of emails a year, probably the same level of phone calls. We're on-site at tournaments talking with parents, players, coaches, pros, just random spectators. We have surveys after every single event that we run, and we send them out. And believe it or not, we actually read every single one of them. But that is true, and we take all this to heart, and it helps us provide some anecdotal evidence as to where we think the issues are, where the gaps in the system, what's working, and what it helps us identify areas that we can effectively improve upon. So that's when we start gathering data. So we pull participation data. We look at participation across various levels of tournaments, across different divisions at tournaments, across different regions. We look at the allocation of tournaments. And by that, I mean how many silver tournaments or gold tournaments or bronze tournaments are in any given region over the course of a year. We look at ranking data. We look at overall number of ranked players. We look at seeding versus ranking at tournaments. We look at a ton of information, and that helps us kind of create a clearer picture of, okay, so we've gathered all this input and feedback. Is what we're hearing reflected in the data? Is it an accurate reflection of the situation on the ground? From there, we kind of create recommendations for policy changes or structural changes that we think will lead to positive impact on the system. And after implementation, with the recommendations, we also have committees that we then talk through those with, use them as a sounding board. We have committees with teaching pros, some are with board members, and some are with parents. But then we ultimately decide yes or no to move forward on a policy or modify it, and then we will release it as we did at the end of last year, saying September 4 this year, these policies will be effective. And then the last stage of the process is as I said, we continue to monitor it. We watch it, we measure the effectiveness of these changes. And if the outcome is not what we expected or what we hoped for, that's when we go back to the drawing board and we make additional tweaks or we make additional changes. And it's an ever-changing system. So the junior squash structure, the competitive structure in the United States, it's never going to be static. It's ever-changing. As I said, the growth continues to force us to change the system to make sure that it is best serving all communities or as many communities as possible in the States. And because it's so rapidly changing and growing so quickly, that requires a whole lot of adjustment, which is exciting in some cases and obviously can be concerning and raise questions for many as well, which is, again, why we're here tonight, and we have scheduled a number of these over the course of September. So moving into some of the data we collected, this is just a baseline ranking analysis of where are the players coming from. There's nothing particularly groundbreaking here. We broke it down by state. We have the most players from New York, next Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and then California was the next state up there, which was pretty interesting. It shows that they've had a tremendous level of growth, and it was nice. And Texas is registering up there as well. So as I said, Houston has been doing some great work, and their community's been growing. So all age groups. So the question was, is this for specific to a division or all age groups, I believe. The graph here on the left is all players in all age groups broken down by state. And then the one on the right is restricted to top 32 players. And we see that the trends effectively are the same with New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, California. So across all across both levels of player, so top 32 and then all.
Yeah, good players from all over the country is
effectively the takeaway. So from there, this one's a little bit complicated, this graph, but then we were looking at the rankings of the players from each region or each state. So here, the top graph, so this one we did pull only the boys 15. It's the largest division. We felt it was a fairly reflective division for most others.
And this is it's the same trend across every age division. So
yeah,
what you're seeing here is the same.
So what this is showing, we have regional rank versus national rank. Regional rank is on the x-axis, national rank is on the y. and each line is a different region. So effectively what this one is showing us is, so New York is orange on this line, so it's got the most players in the region or than any other region, and because it has the shallowest slope, it has the best players of any other region. Something that was very surprising here is that California is a blue line, it keeps pace until about basically the top 50. If you're top 50 in the country, they have roughly the same number of top 50 ranked players as New York, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. And then it holds true with Pennsylvania and Connecticut, while New York then kind of exceeds both. And then obviously these other regions. So Massachusetts was another one, is the blue line, I believe. Yeah, the light blue line, and then Connecticut is the gray line. But either way, the moral of that top one, the top graph, has to do with the fact that California, they have strong players, they have good players, and roughly the same number of top 50 ranked players as other states. From May of last year. So when we were going through the changes. Correct.
So it's 2019.
2019,
Yeah,
correct.
Yes.
What are the axes again?
So the X is so the question, sorry, just for the live stream, but the question was, what are the different axes? And basically X-axis is a player's rank within their own region or state. And then the Y-axis is the player's national ranking.
So then what we did down here is we said, well, let's compare like the main East Coast with people who are not in the East Coast and see what that picture looks like. So you can see down here, this is the East Coast, we've got a ton of players, 220. And if we take everybody outside of that, we have about 80. So there's three times more players on the East Coast and West. And that kind of information can help us think about how many tournaments we're allocating between regions to make sure that it's fair. Ultimately, we want a fair system.
So this slide is effectively just showing the exposure counts and what is the average player, how many tournaments are they playing in a year. And again, nothing particularly groundbreaking here. This top graph is for all players in all age groups, and it's broken down by state. So effectively, the average exposure count, players are on average playing between 5 and 6 tournaments a year. This bottom graph, the orange bar, it breaks it out into if you're a top 32 player. So effectively, it just says that players who are ranked in the top 32 will be playing slightly more than the average player, but they were still keeping it under 9, which is where that inflection point is of your divisor going from 4 to 5. So it was nice. We were seeing that our players have an understanding of the ranking system and are making decisions based on their knowledge there. So this graph is showing where players are coming from who participated in gold tournaments last season. And what we found, so the blue bar is for non-East Coast players participated in a tournament, and the orange bar is for East Coast players. And when we're talking East Coast here, we're defining it as Washington, D.C. and up to Boston or north. So like if you're in Georgia, you were kind of lumped in with the non-East Coast. But what this is showing is, this first tournament here is the Net Sweet Gold, which is last September in San Francisco. So a massive percentage of that gold tournament was fielded by non-East Coast players, with only a very small percentage of East Coast players participating. On the flip side, Princeton Gold, which was, I guess, at Princeton last September, I believe, was almost entirely filled with East Coast players. There's a couple tournaments, like Houston, it's kind of in the middle of the country, and Metro Squash, Chicago. So those ones have a little bit more representation from both East and West Coast, or East and non-East Coast regions. So effectively, this graph was mostly showing that gold tournaments are still largely local, and there's a perception from both coasts. So West Coast players, families tend to say, the East Coast families fly out and crowd our players out of participating in the gold tournaments on our that are local to us, and therefore we can't get into them. And then a lot of East Coast families, obviously there's more gold tournaments on the East Coast, but they're saying a lot of the the West Coast families are flying out here and taking their spots. So this is just kind of showing. So I believe for the NetSuite Gold last year, this little orange bar is about 20 players. So across an entire tournament, not a massive percentage.
And we see the same this year with the Oracle NetSuite space, 10 to 15 players maximum who are currently signed up from the East Coast. So this is just giving us some information about how much people really do travel to tournaments and whether that should impact how we think about allocating tournaments.
Yeah, and then just one side note to note about that is we were just off the summer schedule, which have massive participation numbers, and those ones, summer tournaments for the most part do not follow the same trends as in-season gold tournaments or other tournaments because obviously we're not in school, so missed school isn't a massive issue at that point, but then there's also the summer gold policy, which says only 2 per division count, so effectively if you're playing in your 3rd, your 4th, your 5th, summer gold tournament, you're kind of playing with house money at that point. It's only upward potential from a ranking standpoint if you do worse. So that's why we see so like the Newport Steamer, I think their entry numbers are in the 260s, maybe 280s, maybe, and that's also players from all over the country. So people in our community are looking at tournaments over the summer and saying, like, it's cross-country travel, everyone's playing and everything, these massive turnouts, but that is definitely unique to the summer months. And yes, gold tournaments in season, they are well attended, but they're nowhere near on the scale of a summer gold tournament. So just thought that was important to show before coming here. So this one is just showing the participation levels at gold tournaments. So this graph is only East Coast gold tournaments, and it's an average draw size across each division for every single gold tournament on the East Coast last year. So this graph we thought was important because the general consensus out in the community, at least from what we hear, is that gold tournaments fill. They're always full and they're impossible to get into. And the reality is that does not necessarily pan out. For certain divisions, that is true or more true than others. So for the boys under 17, for example, I think the average participation across all East Coast golds was 30. Obviously, you can only max out at 32. So that's kind of the upper bar there. So any tournaments that are under 32, that'll bring down the average. But there's a number of East Coast golds on the boys 17 last year that did not reach capacity. The real surprise to us was on the girls' side. It looks like the girls 15 was the most well-attended division, which makes sense, but still the average participation across the entire season was about 25 for that division, being the largest average there. So this was a little bit surprising to us based on what we had heard. Obviously, we support these tournaments, so we kind of had a sense that it wasn't true that all gold tournaments fill every division and they're impossible to get into, but thought it was important to kind of show the average participation at each division.
Most concern we hear is around the gold level, which is why we're kind of concentrating on some of that information for tonight. We pull this for every level of tournament.
Mm-hmm. And then if we do bring it down into silver participation, there wasn't a single age group that had an average over 16 at the silver level. And then once we go down to bronze tournaments, we're talking average participation closer to 5. So like for us, that it was kind of highlighting some structural issues or participation issues in terms of what I was saying in the beginning of that entry level doesn't really exist, which then requires people to jump higher and higher, faster and faster, just in search of meaningful competition. So this graph shows player rankings who participated in each level of tournament at the point of the cut list. So by that, I mean, so this first level right here, this first curve, shows the rankings of the JCT players that participated in tournaments last year. So obviously, top 32 is expected, but as we're seeing, there were a number of players that were ranked outside of 32. I think it tails off into the 60s. There were very few that were ranked in the 60s that participated in JCTs last year, but it's not uncommon for someone who's ranked 45 to get into a JCT. And again, that's one of those perception is you need to be top 32. There's no chance you're getting it if you're not top 32. And then also with this graph, we thought it was important to show the inflection point, or the crossover point. So right here, which is a ranking of about 30. This is gold participation, or gold tournament is the yellow line, JCT is the silver. So if you're ranked about 30, 31, that means you're playing in roughly the same number of JCT tournaments as you are gold tournaments. So then bringing that out to the blue line here is silvers. So the crossover between golds and silvers is about 110. So if you're ranked about 110, you're playing equal number of golds and silver tournaments. But something that was pretty startling to us was if you look at the tail of the gold tournaments, it actually goes off to, I think 307 is the lowest ranked player that got into a gold tournament. So again, going to that conversation of they're impossible to get into. There is opportunity to get into them. I'm sorry, I did have, so with this, this data, just some numbers that we pulled were the top 100 players. If you were ranked top 100 last year, you had a 95% chance of being seeded in the 17 to 24 group in a gold tournament. If you were ranked 101 to 150, you still had a 65% chance. So basically 2 and 3 gold tournaments you signed up for, you would be in the 17 to 24 seeding group if you were ranked, let's say 120 in your age group. And then if you were ranked 150 plus, you still had a 1 in 3 chance of being seeded in the 17 to 24 seeding group. And the reason we kind of chose to pick on that 17 to 24 seeding group is because effectively that's where that line was drawn this year. So obviously over the summer with the adjustment to 24 player golds on the East Coast, one of those that just kind of exacerbated the golds are impossible to get into. It's never going to happen again. And based on what we were looking at, there's still a relatively high chance for players that are even ranked outside of 150 to get into gold tournaments still. So we found that interesting. Was there anything else?
I just think the other interesting thing about this graph is that where's the bronze tournament? Where the bronze is, they don't even show that it's not significant at the moment, and we feel like they need to be significant. But as Harry said, the interesting thing here is silvers and golds. So any ranking appears to be able to get into some of those tournaments.
So based on, we did pull more data than that. We thought those slides were particularly important to share with you. But based on all that, it kind of goes back to what I was saying is we see an issue or saw an issue, and a lot of the concerns we were hearing about kind of pointed to a fact that there's really two levels of tournament, which is golds and JCTs. And there is a pretty big mania of I need to play in gold tournaments or else nothing, like I will not be able to improve my ranking. And that's upsetting because it forces families into a situation where they do need to commit very early to significant travel and missing school days and making those sacrifices. And because that bronze, as I was saying, another statistic was, so we kind of crossed out the bronze level there, and we saw how low the bronze participation was on that last graph. Across all bronze tournaments last year, over 220 individual divisions were either canceled or combined. So for that entry-level player who has heard about the sport, may have come to a club like Fairmount and picked up a racket, hit it against a wall, and they're looking to at least explore the option of competitive squash. They sign up for a tournament. Very frequently, it's canceled or combined. And the combined division, although they're still playing it, I'm sure many of you found yourself in a situation like that. But let's say you have a 10-year-old child and only one other player signs up, you get bumped into the 13s, and now you're playing a 12-year-old, and it can be overwhelming. It can be overwhelming if you're new to the sport, and obviously juniors develop very quickly. So 10 to 12, that could be a big difference in physical ability, and that changes the way the sport's played and can completely impact the experience of first jumping on a squash court and could push people away. So we think it's very important to find a way to reinvigorate those lower level. And lower level is probably the wrong word, but it's just the entry level competition. And ultimately, the level is irrelevant as long as you're finding competition that's meaningful to you. And we're finding that, or what we found was that most people couldn't find it locally, which is why then they need to start traveling. And because the gold tournaments largely aren't filling, people tend to gravitate to the highest level, either to look for more meaningful competition or for ranking improvement opportunities. So these are players that maybe could find their need locally. Like in Philadelphia, there's like 12 silver tournaments maybe over the next 6 months, and probably 3 gold tournaments. So there's a decent amount of opportunity here. But if you're looking for to maximize your ranking, or if your silver tournaments aren't filling or your bronze tournaments aren't filling, and you're not getting that meaningful participation or competition that you're looking for, then you need to jump up or look elsewhere. Or unfortunately, you leave the sport and you go play something like soccer. So so a lot of this has to do with just reinforcing the pyramid structure of the tournaments, working to reinvigorate that entry level, and then also just helping people find meaningful competition so that they can stay local for as long as possible.
I think it's also very important. We saw the graph at the beginning of the West versus the East. But for those people who are not on this greater East Coast who don't have the same player pool, to be able to provide that opportunity locally as well. I think the system that we're trying to put in place will give them that with more silver and bronze competition. They will say to us, we need more gold tournaments. What they really mean, I think, really is they need more meaningful competition in that area. And at the moment, they feel they can only get that through gold tournaments. Therefore, they feel forced to travel to find those competitive play. So our hope is that by providing more silvers and bronzes, and with the new draw sizes at goals, that we'll be able to fulfill their needs locally, at least so they can stay in their region for longer before they have to commit to that travel.
So again, this just kind of goes back to that initial slide that we had about our vision. In fact, it is the same slide, but it is the expected impacts, where to reinforce that pyramid structure. We want people we want to provide a pathway for players to go from I'm new to squash, and like how can I get involved, to I'm interested in squash, how can I take it to the next level, finding my way up through the system. So we want to be able to provide a pathway, which we believe is very important, and that has to do with a lot of the way the point structure was created. So it's overlapped in order to be able to provide mobility from one level to the next. A lot of people struggle to find a way or a clear path from, let's say I have 0 points today and I'm an under 15 player, but I want to play in a JCT. How do I get there? And if you're starting from scratch, it's definitely going to be more difficult than if you had aged up with points or you started when you were super young. But if you play in a silver tournament and you win a silver tournament, let's say a couple silver tournaments, and your average is, so top level for a silver right now is 840, but let's say win a couple, come second, third, fourth in a couple, your average is about 750 probably. That 840 number is the equivalent of about 13th place in a gold tournament. And if you are finishing the top 6 of a silver tournament, you're earning more points than the last place players in a gold tournament. So you're effectively displacing those players that are performing poorly in gold tournaments if you're performing well in silver tournaments. And then the exact same process applies for golds into JCT. So now I've gotten my way into gold tournaments and I've had a couple of strong performances. If you're finishing, I think it's a 9-player overlap, so 1 through 9 in a gold tournament is more than the bottom of a JCT. So if you are consistently recording strong results at a gold tournament, you are in theory going to be displacing players that are just squeaking into JCTs and having poor performances. So, and then that's also where parents and players start to strategize. It's like, oh, maybe it won't make sense for me to play in a JCT because I can maximize my points. I think I have a better chance of winning a gold. Or some people are like, JCTs or nothing. Like I'm in, I'm playing, I'm going to soak this up. So the pathways are incredibly important, and it's something that is on the forefront of our mind to make sure to monitor, and making sure that that mobility exists both from an upward standpoint and a downward standpoint. Because the downward mobility can be overlooked as well. We need to make sure that if you are doing poorly in one level, the players that are doing well in another level effectively displace you. So that is something that is going to be closely monitored over the coming months, and as well as where those cutoff lines are for qualification into tournaments. And by that, I mean, if I don't get into a gold tournament, let's say, because my points don't qualify me in, do I have the ability to meaningfully improve my point average by playing in silver tournaments? Or is it just you got cut out and there's no way to improve? So that's obviously a problem, and something that we are monitoring closely. And I think there will certainly be a few months that are required to allow these changes to kind of take hold and get people competing in them, because there are obviously adjustments to the points table. Families are reestablishing their strategies of how to which tournaments to play in, any travel that they want to plan around squash for participation in tournaments, either for competition, travel, or ranking purposes. But all this is incredibly important, and as I alluded in our processes, it's just an ongoing process where we evaluate, we make sure that the changes are actually effective, that they're positive, and that they were intended. So there's potential adjustments that we could make on a fairly quick basis, namely points adjustments. If that overlap isn't working properly, we can adjust the points again and make sure that overlap does exist. If you're winning silver, if you basically have a point average of 840, so you've won every silver, but you still can't get into a gold. Again, problem. And then if silver tournaments, let's say in Philadelphia, are just blowing up, they have way too many participants, that means the allocation is off, which means we can add additional silver tournaments to the area to help offset some of that demand. So there are, I don't want to call them contingencies, but there are adjustments we can continue to make to make sure that the players are finding the competition that works for them and is right for them. And that was kind of my rant there. Just so yeah, that's effectively the presentation, and but we can, again, we're here for as long as anyone has questions. September 4th, yeah. So the question was asking if we have seen massive, I guess, wait lists for silver tournaments, if they've been oversubscribed, and if that's a point of concern yet. And the answer is there have been certain tournaments that have had wait lists at the silver level and the gold level as well, but
Whereas they have in the past.
yes, so they haven't in the past, because so all tournaments, just as a point of reference of where things were, every single tournament was open to 32 players. And part of that issue that we were finding is because we couldn't even fill that top level tournament, the silvers were struggling, and then the bronzes were effectively cannibalized. So that entry level local competition didn't exist. So the hope was by reducing spots at the gold level, that the local silver and bronze tournaments will get bigger, which means families need to travel less. You find competition that meets your needs locally, and obviously or families that then get to a point where they have a ranking or a point average that would qualify them into a gold or a JCT, they can make that decision when they want. But so there have been wait lists. They're not wait lists of concern, and that's also something that we've discussed at length. Is a lot of people confuse a wait list or a well-attended tournament with a competitive tournament. which isn't always the case. It means it's a well-attended tournament, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a competitive one. So from the standpoint of a gold tournament, if we have, and I guess I'll say that there are some consequences to a wider range of player abilities at the same tournament. One being, it can be a worse experience if there's a bunch of matches that effectively, just using the language of tonight, like haven't been meaningful for both players on court. And then it also brings into, if there's a massive spread between player ability, squash is self-refereed or refereed by your peers. So there's also different levels of knowledge of the sport if there's a huge range in the ability. So that could also lead to additional refereeing issues on site, just because you're not used to, or a player may not be used to refereeing at that level.
Yes. We have seen waitlists.
Rough changes because you may end up with an 17.
So the way we schedule tournaments is, so let me see where to start. Our support structure for external tournaments is we are now giving tournament directors the option to ask us to schedule their tournaments for them. We're not saying we do it perfectly, but we schedule a lot of tournaments every year. And every tournament you schedule, you learn something. And what we've started doing at JCTs is we have just a general guideline is you can't referee more than one age group above you. And then we also, because we see larger incidents of issue, at least people coming and reporting it to us, rightly or wrongly, with the U11 age group refereeing anyone, even if it's another U11 person or if it's a U13 person, which makes sense. I mean, they can be as young as 7. I mean, we've seen maybe even 6. And at that point, even just keeping up with the score can be difficult, especially if you players on court that just jump right into it. So like at JCTs, we effectively silo off U11s onto their own 2 courts for the day, and they just kind of referee each other, and we'll assign a support staff to those 2 courts to make sure that everything's okay, that nothing's really going astray, and there to enforce the code of conduct as well. But yeah, so then we'll generally start with the young players, and we'll do on the other courts, the 13s followed by the 15s, 17s, 19s. We've thought about inverting it, but that leads to a situation where you have 18-year-olds playing at 8 in the morning and 10-year-olds playing at 9 at night, and it could be better from a refereeing standpoint, but I'm sure from a yeah.
That's not good.
Was there an opportunity maybe to have the U17s and U19s do like a mentorship program for the U11s and U13s? Because I mean, personally, we find that there's so much controversy, mostly I think because the kids, they just don't know. And then if they have the older kids pressuring them, that is a lot, that's a struggle. So maybe to have, I don't know whether they be paid or unpaid, but like opportunities for the older kids when they're not playing to chaperone the U11 and U13s, or explain like, actually that was a stroke and here's why, so they could be learning along with it.
Can you,
So I apologize, I'm not running away. I just realized it's getting dark.
You frightened me.
No, it's a good comment. I think we've been asked that question before. It is a very valid point. But I think Harry had some experience with that a few years ago.
Yeah, so we did look into that, and it's a great program on its face, and to be honest, we didn't fully execute it, but it's difficult to corral the U17s and 19 players from or just basically find from a staffing standpoint. So do you sign up for it before? Does US Squash mandate if you're going to receive a ranking that you need to work at a tournament as a referee? Is that one too many requirements, considering that now there's the referee exam, you can play in all the tournaments, and then especially as you get older, you got your schoolwork, you're trying to get into college. It's just, we're packing on all of the requirements. So it would need to be a volunteer basis, effectively what we.
I was going to piggyback on what you were saying. You also find with some of the younger players that as soon as they start wrestling with each other, after they play together, they start chatting about the match they just had, and there's a whole match going on that they're not watching.
Yeah.
And then you have the people on the court turning around and going, "What was it?" And they're like,
don't know, I wasn't watching.
We were talking.
So,
I'm not saying that I did this. And you got yelled at by one of the refs, but I watched the match, please.
no, and you're making a very good point too. And I think what we are trying to encourage our tournament directors to do is to to have what we call match supervisors.
Yeah.
So when we're at JCTs, we have extra staff whose sole purpose is to watch for that kind of behavior. And if they see the kids talking to each other or looking at their phones, it's like, you need to focus. Take the phones away. I have literally taken the phone away from somebody and said, you can get it at the desk after you finish your match. So we're trying to encourage our tournament directors to take responsibility in the same way in their own tournaments.
So then the other, so I was going to say, so the one piece I had was the logistic piece of getting them to the tournament and helping. And the second piece, which we had concerns about, was there are concerns about the quality of refereeing when U17s and U19s are refereeing. So would it be fair to basically the same, we believe that the same concerns would still be voiced, whether or not it's a U13 or a U17, because the U17 and 19 referees, I mean, we have world certified referees at a lot of our tournaments, and they've gone through the ringer in terms of assessments and the number of matches they've needed to ref at all levels, and they are still getting told that they're wrong most of the time. So with that level of certification, if we have under 17s and 19s that we're assisting, are they quote unquote qualified to do it? And then the last piece that was probably the most concern is, are we throwing them into the lion's den? Tournaments can be intense, and a lot of us are still struggle to appropriately manage contentious situations, either managing the players on court or spectators that are watching. So it can be difficult to throw a minor into a situation that is difficult to manage and put them, like, it would be unfair to put them into that situation if they're just showing up out of the goodness of their heart to help mentor an U11 or U13. But it's something that we've tried to make work and we'll continue talking about.
I think there's another point from your initial question about the refereeing is, in the past, last year, when we have so many combined divisions, or any cancel divisions, it's hard sometimes to have that 11s to 13s to 15s, because suddenly you don't have a 13s anymore. So you're going from 11s to 15s or 13s to 17s. And then you create that age gap that does really often present problems when refereeing. A 12-year-old refereeing, 16-year-old doesn't often end well. So if we can have more tournaments with all the divisions being played, that will definitely help that whole scheduling and refereeing issue problem. But the refereeing is a big one for us. I mean, we have new officiating clinics this year, which we hope programs will give to their players to help them be better referees. But it's a constant source of struggle. Like, how do we do this? How do we improve the refereeing of our juniors? But also remember, they are juniors and they are learning.
A question about tournament seating.
Yes.
There are rules.
Yes.
And also there are cases where the rules don't apply. So who functionally determines the seating if the rules don't apply? It's the director of the tournament?
US Squash does the seating for every tournament.
Yeah, we do all. Yeah.
So the expectation is that it's points based. So there's a seating points calculation, which is in the guidelines. And while that tends to mirror rankings, there are situations where the seating point calculation will be slightly different than the rankings point calculation, which has to do mostly with players that have played in fewer than 4 tournaments in a calendar year, or has fewer than 4 active tournaments. But then there are cases, let's say at a gold tournament, the number 1 player from Canada signs up for a gold tournament and he got in or she got in because there was a playing position available. And so that's what I'm saying. So that's where US Squash would jump in and say, this person is not the 32 seed. It's not a foolproof process, because without them participating in our system and having established a ranking and a playing record for themselves, there's a certain amount of guesswork, but we we scour the internet. We go to their various NGB websites if they have them to look for results. We look at European tournaments. We try and find a crossover between players. It's a similar process to the Junior Open seeding, just on a smaller scale. And then we effectively put them in a place where we feel comfortable answering questions as to why we put them there. So if there's a question as to should this person be higher than that person, if there's not a pretty clear answer, we generally put them below them. But then what I meant by it's not a foolproof process is that that's one component, and then the other piece is identifying the players. So most of the draws, or all draws effectively, it's a software that just looks at the seeding points, and then you click seed it and put it into a draw, and then the scheduling piece is more manual than that, but there needs to be a human that looks over the draws. One of our staff members, we have someone assigned to all tournaments from gold all the way down to bronze, and then you need to find a way to identify a player and then determine whether or not a seeding adjustment needs to be made, because if they have a 0 playing record, it's possible they are the 32 seed in the tournament, but it's also possible that they're the number 1 seed in the tournament or somewhere in between there. So if your children are in tournaments and you see someone that is in a draw and you're concerned about where they are going to be seated, definitely send us an email, and we're always looking into it. It's much easier for us to look into it before the seeding comes out and the draws are released than to make an adjustment after the draws have come out and someone says, well, this person is better than that. And then we need to send that like, okay, draws are re-released now for your division, please check in. So if you do see someone, just let us know, please.
How does that work if a player plays up in the division? So if they play up, let's say they're U13 and they play up in U15, or if they're U13 and they play up in U17, they convert it like 50% and 50% again?
So if you're playing up one age group, it is as if you've aged up. So if you have any active tournaments in that division, those are automatically used. Yeah. And then the remainder down to 4 or up to 4. So let's say you've only played in one. If you're a U13 player choosing to play in the under 15s, you have one active U15 tournament, you would convert 3 tournaments from the U13s to the 15s. I believe that's still 50%. But
so I don't know if you noticed that we changed the age up percentages per age up group. So we felt that generally at the younger age groups were aging up too high, and the older age groups were aging up too low. We did some analysis on that. We looked at the ratings equivalency and had a look at where they would be if it was the rating that was an indicator of playing level, what the points were in those older divisions to work out what the average percentage should be. So it's 45% from 11s to 13s, going up to 65% from 17s to 19s. So all those, when they age up, that factor is applied to the younger age group points.
So we go 50%, and then we have nothing. Say we have no points in the
15. Yeah. All 4, your top 4 would be converted.
And then they cut 50% again.
50% and then 60%.
60%.
Because it's 60% from 15 to 17. Yes. So you 2 factors. Sorry, you've been trying to ask a question for a long time. So.
Yeah, right now, the draw from the 34 to 24. After the tournament, some parents think still not stay the time. Right now, the tournament still requires all play available on the Friday afternoon until the Sunday afternoon. That things doesn't stay for top time or the hotel fee or something like that.
So the question is, I believe, if it's cut down to 24, why does it still take 2.5 days? So Friday night, all day Saturday. Just the overall number of matches. So and rounds that need to be played. If with a 24 draw, if you play in the first round and you go all the way to the consolation, that's through the consolation finals. That's 6 rounds that need to be played. So if we were to scrunch it all into Saturday and Sunday only, I think that would be 3 matches both days is a ton, and then getting 3 matches on Sunday or playing 3 rounds on Sunday with 3 hours minimum between scheduled match times. You're going to be there all day on Sunday. So we could potentially do it on 2 days, but it would be basically 8 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m. both days. And being at a squash tournament that late on a Sunday could be difficult.
So I think for the under 17s and 19s, that would be a lot of matches. The quality of play at that level is so high. Yeah. So it's cool.
It also will depend on the facility. Depending on how many courts the facility has, that will determine how many days that each player will play or manage that.
Yeah, we just played a single race.
Yeah.
That's a 16 goal.
Yes. Yes.
Still less than 3 days.
Because we had six courts.
Yeah.
Because we only had 6 courts, so there's a balance in the number of courts as well. You can't do a 16-player draw over 2 days on 6 courts. You need 10. Actually, you need 8 courts to be able to do that in 2 days.
So we play only one match every day.
But it's not only your match. You have 16 draws, 160 people who are playing. No, so where were you? Finger Lakes, the Cornell. Right. I believe that only has 6 courts. And the nearest course to that are like an hour away. So it's a balance. So is it a better experience this is a balance we have to make and a choice you make. Is it better for you to have a 2-day experience potentially with 2 venues an hour apart? Or is it better to do a 3-day experience in the same venue? And some people will vote one way and some people will vote the other way.
Because not one of the venues supposed to be
Well, there's a balance. It was a summer tournament. So. Sure. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so the Junior Open this year, just for everyone, the policy change is for U.S. players, you need to have a ranking inside the top 75 as of the entry deadline. And then for international players, each country is capped at 8 players per division. And they also needed to receive an endorsement from their NGB. But my sense is that we're talking about the U.S. component. And a lot of this has to do with both reducing the size of the tournament. The tournament at 900 players is massive. Probably closer to it. Last year was 900. We get about 1,100 entries. But it's very difficult to find the number of courts. So, I mean, this year, I think we're still, unfortunately, spread out at a lot of facilities. But the hope was to reduce the size, make it more manageable, which would then also improve the overall player experience, which would then also hopefully attract more top-level international players and effectively raise the overall caliber of the tournament to a standard similar to the British Open.
My understanding is also for high school that each school is allowed to play community.
That's correct. One team per gender, but correct, yes. And very similar. So last year we went from, I guess 2 years ago we had 186 teams. Last year we jumped up to 210. 7-player rosters. That was about, what is that, like 1,600 students that are playing, which is a ton of fun, to be honest, once you get over like the tiring nature of running the tournament. But it's honestly one of my favorite tournaments that we go to, being able to see a lot of these players that we see at JCTs that are competing against each other, but operating together and supporting one another, because we rarely get to see them in that kind of mindset. But the tournament it just grew to a point where no one area could really support that. And then, so I think last year we needed to, after the entries closed, we needed to find a 6th facility, each of them being about 45 minutes apart. So it's just a very disjointed tournament at that point, where although the opportunity to play was there, it wasn't really a cohesive championship feel, because you would have like your Division 1 venue, and then 45 minutes to an hour away, you have your Division 2 and 3 venue, and then at the end of a match, the players are focused on playing, and their coach is like, I'm not driving you 45 minutes to go watch that match.
No, it's sort of addressing that issue of having to travel between venues. I live an hour from here, 50 minutes from here, and so there are times where weather is different. I have different weather than you. And what do you do in a situation like that? And there's I'm not going to come here and have a hotel room when I'm 45 minutes away, but I do have a different climate. Who knows? So what do you do in those situations? What is and in tournaments where
weather's tricky.
Weather's tricky because I remember that at Yale there was like a foot of snow and people were trying to get from place to place.
Yeah. So, and weather's also tricky from the standpoint of we basically need to wait until we know what the weather is. So there's forecasts that'll say you're going to get 3 feet of snow, and we're like, we might not. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago in New York City, they shut down every subway. They told cars you needed to remove yourself from the road, and we didn't even get an inch. So it can cause massive disruptions to effectively jump too soon. Obviously, from the standpoint of running a city, it's different from running a relatively small tournament when we're talking about the number of people there. But either way, safety is the priority, and ultimately, we need to make a decision once we know what we've been dealt. So we kind of, at least for U.S. squash, our tournaments, we make a habit of saying, we'll send emails saying, we are aware that this weather system is here and is forecast, and we're monitoring it, and no decision has been made yet, and we'll let you know when something changes, if something changes, but plan accordingly. And then, unfortunately, families need to make decisions. Like, safety is paramount importance. So families need to make decisions for themselves in terms of whether or not they're comfortable making the trip. And we generally do allow, we're fairly lenient. I know we've kind of bark our policies through our emails, or it might seem that way, but in extenuating circumstances, we are fairly understanding. We know people, for the most part, are making every effort they can to get to tournaments, and life happens, both personal and then everything that's uncontrollable. So
Just don't want to see it.
it's one of those things we can't automatically say like nothing will happen, but we hear people, we listen to people, we talk to people, and we can be nice sometimes.
We like brownies and we like cookies, so we're private.
We have a heart.
The US question include college squash.
College squash?
Yeah, we don't have information about that.
So, interesting you say that. So I'll start and then I'll let Kim take over because she's more well versed in this, despite the fact that she's from England. So the executive director of the CSA actually works out of the U.S. squash office, so we have a very close relationship with him. His name's David Pullman, and he works very closely with every program. And we're actually planning, I believe, or we're hoping to have some type of college information session at the Philly JCT in a couple weeks at the beginning of October. It won't be restricted to just participants of the tournament, so anyone that is local can come and hear about it. But Kim, I think over the last 2 days, have had actually a couple of very long meetings with David, so she can fill you in on anything else.
Yeah, no, I was very interested because I'm from England. I didn't grow up in this system, and I think many of the people who are playing squash, the parents probably didn't grow up in this system either. And yet everyone is talking about playing in college. It's like a massive thing, particularly at the JCT level. And every tournament that you play, or every match that you play, or every point that you lose, everyone is so concerned about how it's going to affect their college application process. So I think we need to educate more and give more information on exactly what is college squash, how do you get to play college squash, what does the process look like, what do you need to do, when do you need to do it, what is important, what are the college coaches looking for. So I think there's just such a lack of information. So David is going to do these sessions in Philadelphia at the JCT, and we're going to be producing some more educational material also for all the parents out there too. From those who are in the under 11s and 13s who are really just beginning their journey, it's like, we know this may be a goal of yours, so this age, you don't need to worry about it, just play, have fun, do as well as you can. The under 17s and 19s obviously are in the thick of it, and for them it's more detailed, like you should be contacting the coaches in this way at this time, or they will contact you in this way at this time. And we hope that that's just going to help the overall, or maybe reduce the concern amongst parents. I think David was very interesting. He said to me, "Oh, and how many places a year are there in college squash?" There's about 35 varsity programs in the colleges in this country. If you say 3 places on average are open each year, there's three recruitment spots each year. That's 105 spots in our varsity programs. The varsity colleges is just a list of Ivy League. Like squash has probably got the highest level of colleges available to it when you're looking at going to college. So 105 spots are available. Harry, how many people do you think are graduating every year from squash in the year 19s?
Probably between like 50 and 75. So
there's
not a massive number.
So there is a spot there. So it's like it's okay. You can be ranked 50, you can be ranked 75, you can be ranked 100. There is a spot there for you in college squash. But the most important thing is, what do you want to do academically? Is there a squash place for you? Is this the right balance between academics and squash? And we're lucky, we're fortunate that there are actually more spots open than we have people graduating. So you could have a choice. People don't necessarily know this information, and I think it's really important that we start talking about it so that we can allay some of your fears and tell you what that process should be for
you. How about the regional championships? Do you still have it, or
pardon?
The regional championships?
Questions about the regional championships.
Regional championships,
yes.
Those still do exist. I think 4 of them are on the calendar and 4 more to come. They will be over the week of November 22nd, so the week leading into Thanksgiving, immediately prior to Thanksgiving. Pardon? They stay the same. So the points are the same. They're still points optional for players that participate. And you need to be a resident of the region.
It's something we continue to discuss is what we should be doing to evolve the regional championships. Any other questions?
So is there any change in terms of the deadline for signing up earlier, or what kind of
So we did move the deadline to sign up earlier. So for gold tournaments, we went from 2.5 to 3.5, and part of the reasons for that was that it's like you basically know if you're in or out. Obviously, there's waitlist players who will not know whether or not they're into a tournament until a position becomes available, if one does become available. But for those that are in for gold tournaments, now 3.5 weeks is outside of the 21-day window, which generally translates to lower travel and hotel costs. And then it also allows them to begin planning earlier. With the draws coming out earlier, it's a little bit trickier because, I mean, for the most part, we've probably come close to scheduling out all JCTs for the whole year. But players, like the draw itself is one thing, and then players' position on a draw is the seeding. And there's actually a decent amount of movement and withdrawals leading into a tournament. So the earlier we release the information, the higher the chances of changes to the draws, which means the information you receive will not be the same closer to the event. So it's a balancing act. We want to get the information out as soon as possible and kind of say like, okay, this tournament's done and we can move to the next one from a planning standpoint. But yeah, there's a lot of different moving pieces that we need to account for. So that, yeah, so with that, like the division start times will say which division, if there's multiple, or sorry, which venue, if there's multiple, your player's division will be at. So that can help if there is a difference in which hotel you might want to book. And then it'll also say the first match in your division will be taking place at X time. Generally, that holds true now because JCT's filled. So a couple of years ago, when there were a handful of buys in the first round, you might have a Friday evening match, you might have a Saturday morning match. That changes things. So it's less of an issue with the JCTs.
And then I think it's important also the silver registration deadline was moved from 1.5 weeks to 2.5 weeks. So a little bit more time for silver tournaments also.
Yeah, I just want to know or confirm what the policy for outside for the coaching.
You mean during a match?
Yeah.
So while a match is in play, I guess in between games, it's okay. While a point is going on or in between points, that's not, it's just against the rules of squash.
Yeah, because we always see some coaching or tennis, coach outside, even though.
Yeah, so this goes into effectively a conduct process that we have. So if you see, it's kind of like the MTA, if you see something, say something, or TSA, find the tournament director, and the tournament director can deal with the situation. And we have been working on our processes of having tournament directors then report information to us, and then we follow up with families or players with generally, a lot of the times it's just a letter saying, we understand this happened. Don't let it happen again because it's against the rules. Otherwise, there will be more serious action taken. And then depending on the situation that happens, we can escalate more quickly to more serious actions than a letter. But yeah, so definitely we ask that you don't necessarily confront people directly, other families, other players, or parents at tournaments. Find the tournament director. The tournament director will hopefully manage the situation, deal with it, and resolve it. And all of this stuff will be reported to US Squash, and we keep a record of everything, and we follow up with the necessary parties.
Definitely, if you see something, say something, because what I hate to see on the surveys is something like US Squash should do something about. And you're like, well, if someone had told us about it, then we would. We can't do anything if we don't know. And also, even if you think it's maybe not enough to report, it could be part of the trend. You know, if you saw something and then, you saw something and we see 2 or 3 people saying something about a certain family or a certain coach, it might be a trend to us to then have a conversation with that person. So please let us know. Questions, or are we? All right, well, thank you so much for coming.